Access Minnesota. Issues that matter to you. Access Minnesota brings you the newsmakers and the stories that shape our everyday lives, with analysis from University of Minnesota faculty experts.
In the spring and summer of 1934, the bloodiest battle in Minnesota's labor history unfolded right here on the streets of Minneapolis's Warehouse District. On one side were the truckers, represented by the Teamsters Union. On the other side, the Citizens Alliance represented business interests in Minneapolis. Some people called it a civil war between labor and business. But when the strike was finally resolved, Minneapolis became a much friendlier city toward unions. And that's the focus of this month's Access Minnesota. We'll talk with Randy Croce from the University of Minnesota's Labor Education Services and Steve Beffert, who is a law professor at the University of Minnesota who specializes in labor law. Our guest is Randy Croce from the Labor Education Service at the University of Minnesota. Randy, welcome to Access Minnesota.
Thanks for inviting me.
Let's talk about some of the key moments in the labor movement in the United States. One certainly has to be the Haymarket Incident in 1886, which set the stage for May Day. Tell us about that and why it's so important.
Well, that came in the context of the first really long-lasting major labor organization, the Knights of Labor, which were founded in 1869. And they were pushing for the 8-hour day. Now, part of it was they believed in uplift unionism, that if people had more time to study and pursue cultural activities and so forth, they would be better people and we'd create a better society. But on May 1st of that year, 1886, a Saturday, hundreds of thousands of people across the United States went out to march for the 8-hour day. The next Monday, several workers were killed in front of a reaper manufacturing plant. And the next day, Tuesday, a rally was called to protest those killings. Even the mayor was there, and a number of anarchists and other labor speakers were there. It was breaking up, and somebody threw a bomb which killed some policemen. Policemen fired, killed other people, and a number of labor leaders were rounded up and blamed for this bomb, which to this day nobody knows who really threw. But it was used as a way to suppress the growing labor movement. And it really was the death knell for the Knights of Labor. The next organization that came in was the American Federation of Labor, which continues today in the form of the AFL-CIO. But that move for the 8-hour day, even though it wasn't successful for many decades later, really sparked international interest in labor. And so May Day is still celebrated as a national holiday in Latin America and in Europe, where people get the day off. And it's been sort of supplanted by Labor Day in this country, but May Day is still really the workers' day in most of the world.
Another key moment in U.S. union history took place in 1911 in New York City, the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. Tell us about that and how that tended to energize the progressive movement and to some extent people who perhaps had never really understood why labor was trying to organize.
Well, the majority of women that were working and making these shirtwaists in really terrible conditions in factories in New York City were primarily immigrant women who were helping their households bring in enough money to survive. On the day of a fire on an upper story of this Triangle Shirtwaist factory, the fire escape gave way and the elevators didn't work anymore, and the doors downstairs to the downstairs had been locked. And so these women on the 9th and 10th floors piled up against that door, and finally, having no other way to escape the fire, jumped out of the windows, and over 140 young women were killed, either burned or killed in the falls. This so outraged people in New York City that it really fueled the progressive movement to improve the conditions in factories and for the places workers lived, in tenements. And Frances Perkins, who was a journalist who saw this horrible fire and saw the women jumping, was so energized that she dedicated herself to reform, and she became the first woman cabinet member as the Secretary of Labor under FDR, and oversaw many of those changes, including the National Labor Relations Act, which was the foundation for collective bargaining from the year it was passed, 1935, to the present day.
The labor movement was sometimes characterized as a leftist movement. There was often associations that were made, in some cases perhaps rightly, often wrongly, with even the communist movement at that time. How detrimental to the labor union, especially in its early stages, were those references to, you know, this is something that's being undertaken by a bunch of people who may be socialists or communists?
Well, yeah, labor has long been branded as being Reds. In some cases, it's been a badge of honor. There's an old IWW Wobbly song called "You Ain't Been Doing Nothing If You Ain't Been Called a Red." In most cases, I don't think unionists were trying to actually create a communist state, but they did have ideas that the fate of the group was important, that if individuals were going to attain their rights to decent pay and working conditions, that they were going to have to pursue it collectively. And that's a similar orientation to socialism, I suppose. And so it certainly has been detrimental. It was used as a brush, you know, the communist brush, in the 1940s, and led to the passage of the Taft-Hartley Act, which prohibited communists from being in unions and created a lot of internal conflict, which certainly weakened the labor movement.
If we talk about a pivotal moment in the labor movement here in Minnesota, it would have to be the summer of 1934 and the truckers' strike. Tell us about that.
The Citizens Alliance, which was a group of businessmen and bankers, held a lot of power in Minneapolis. Wages were considerably lower here because they used a carrot and a stick. They would penalize companies that would give raises, and they would also provide support, easier banking terms and so forth, and also provided some advantages to hiring, albeit at lower wages for workers here. And the truckers decided to challenge that power of the Citizens Alliance because truckers were making substandard wages, way less than they were in other places. It started out with coal drivers who were successful because many of those truckers who went out in February when people really needed coal owned their own trucks. So they could walk away with the keys, and after a short time without coal in Minnesota February, they were successful. So that drew many truckers to believe that they could be successful in a wider strike of all the truckers and warehouse workers. It was a really bloody confrontation. Citizen Alliance not only had police, but they had hired other deputies. And there were hand-to-hand combats with clubs and so forth. 2 people on each side were killed. The 2 union workers were killed by police gunfire, and over 100 were injured. But the violence was so great, and there were also strikes at the same time in Toledo, Ohio, and a general strike in San Francisco, that I think the government realized that there had to be some way to manage these conflicts. And in fact, the FDR came to Minnesota and was persuaded to bring some pressure to bear on the banks, and that combined with popular support for the strike really brought that strike to an end. And it was a successful strike and unionized and set the stage the following year for the National Labor Relations Act, which tried to manage these kind of conflicts in a peaceful way through collective bargaining, and that's the model that continues to this day.
Well, there was a labor dispute in Minnesota in the 1980s that got a lot of national attention in Austin, the Hormel P9 strike. Tell us about that.
P9 represented packing house workers for Hormel in Austin, Minnesota. And the pattern of bargaining between United Food and Commercial Workers, their parent union across the country, had given a lot of concessions, decreased pensions, decreased wages, and P9 decided that they were going to stand up against this. And they waged a very bitter strike, which they ultimately lost. And the actual parent union, seeing that they were likely to lose, actually stopped supporting the strike, which pretty much doomed it to failure. And the problem was that these jobs had been middle-class living wage jobs. after that strike and the concessions that came with the loss of the strike, those wages became very low. And so a lot of people left those jobs. Subsequently, a lot of immigrants took those jobs. People who had made way less money in the countries from which they came and were willing to take those jobs because they represented at least a step up and a chance to join the American workforce. So those jobs became lower paid jobs and actually more dangerous jobs because some of the union protections that were there were lessened. And so now the packing industry in Minnesota, at least, is dominated by immigrant workers.
It's 2010 in America. What would you say to people who might look back and say, I owe a lot to the labor movement. It gave me a 40-hour work week. It helped me get better benefits. It helped improve my wages. But that was then, this is now. I don't feel that my company is treating me unfairly. I feel that I'm fairly well compensated. I have great benefits. Why are unions relevant anymore?
They're certainly relevant for a lot of people in jobs where they're not treated very well. Certainly janitors that were prevented from having full-time jobs and had insurance premiums that were way more than they could possibly afford. And after they had a successful campaign, they were able to achieve health insurance premiums that suddenly allowed them to insure their families and themselves. I mean, they certainly could say that unions are relevant. And unfortunately, without a contract or without some kind of legal protection, most working people are basically dependent on the goodwill of their employer. And in some places, Silicon Valley has some pretty good working conditions, and other companies do, but there's no guarantee of those things. A contract gives you some sort of guarantee. Now, there are different models in Italy and France. You have a strong labor party, and a lot of those protections, for instance, for vacation and for health care are guaranteed by the government because of past union activity in the Labor Party. Here we're pretty much left with the relationship between employers and employees for a lot of that. And so in order to achieve and to safeguard those, I think unionization is still really relevant. And as more and more of these jobs are outsourced, I think some people in professions will see that. I mean, there was an effort, for example, to organize the lawyers in the Attorney General's office here in the state of Minnesota. Those lawyers thought they needed a union, and I'm hearing this from medical professionals too, as the profit margin and as you say, competitiveness increase. I think professionals are seeing the need for some kind of organization to safeguard their interests as well. So I don't think it's just a blue-collar phenomenon.
Randy Croce from the Labor Education Service at the University of Minnesota, thanks so much for joining us on Access Minnesota.
And thanks for discussing all this with me.
When Access Minnesota returns, more of our conversation with Randy Croce from the University of Minnesota's Labor Education Services.